Okay, I think I'll get started. As I said, I'm Mark Zimmerman. I'm in the School of Public Health at the University of Michigan. I'm one part of the FACS leadership team. And we're about to start our final session for the day. This session is going to be focused on firearm research funding opportunities and research priorities. As a reminder to everybody, this session is being recorded. Chat is disabled, but if you have any questions or questions, you can use the Q&A feature for your questions. And then the live transcript will be available for this session. If you prefer to hide captions, please click the up arrow next to the transcript button and select hide transcript. Well, with the changes that we're seeing in our society on so many different levels, one of the brighter spots for firearm research is that more funding opportunities are occurring at the federal level. And so we're delighted to have this afternoon's panel of NIH and CDC leaders. And so I'm going to introduce them. They'll speak for 10 to 15 minutes each, and then we'll come back for questions and answers. And first, we have Caitlin Bergdorf, health scientist and American Association for Advancement of Sciences Science Technology Policy Fellow. I was one of those once. She's in the Office of Behavioral and Social Sciences Research at the National Institutes of Health. Dr. Valerie Mahomes is the chief of the Pediatric Trauma and Critical Illness Branch at the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. Stephen O'Connor, he is the chief of Suicide Prevention Research Program in the Division of Services and Interventions Research at the National Institute of Mental Health. Dr. Nathan Stinson, he's the Director of Health and Population Science at the National Institute of Minority Health and Health Disparities. And finally, Dr. Thomas Simon, he's the Associate Director for Science in the Division of Violence Prevention at the National Center for Injury Prevention and Control at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And as I said, after the presentations, we will have our Q&A. So without further ado, Caitlin, you're up. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much to the organizers for coordinating such an excellent day of research talks and for allowing myself and other representatives from NIH and CDC speak with you today. My name is Caitlin Bergdorf. I'm a health scientist in the Office of Behavioral and Social Sciences Research, or OBSSR, as I may call it throughout the presentation, at the National Institutes of Health. Today, I'll be giving an overview of the firearm injury and mortality prevention research at NIH, which will be followed by presentations from my colleagues at the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, the National Institute of Mental Health, and the National Institute of Minority Health and Health Disparities. We'll be speaking about research priorities and potential funding opportunities specific to their institute. Next slide, please. So as you might expect, NIH's mission helps inform any initiative that NIH develops or funds. Firearm violence prevention research aligns well with NIH's mission, which is to seek fundamental knowledge about the nature and behavior of living systems and the application of that knowledge to enhance health, lengthen life, and reduce illness and disability. As a result, NIH has always funded firearms research within its overall violence portfolio. Next slide, please. So next, let me describe the structure of NIH and where OBSSR, the office that I sit in, and where that sits within the NIH structure. So the NIH is comprised of 27 institutes and centers, and the Office of the Director, as you see here. The Office of the Director is a central office at NIH, which is responsible for setting policy at NIH and for planning, managing, and coordinating the programs and activities of all the NIH components. Next slide, please. So within the Office of the Director exists a division called the Division of Program Coordination, Planning, and Strategic Initiatives, or DPCIPC. And the Office of Behavioral and Social Sciences Research was established as an office in 1995 in recognition of the key role that behavioral and social factors often play in illness and health. Some of the activities OBSSR engages in are listed on the screen, such as integration of BSSR into the broader biomedical research efforts consistent with the NIH mission, coordination and collaboration with institutes and centers, identification of critical challenges that are barriers to advancement in BSSR, focus on challenges that OBSSR is uniquely positioned to address. So because of our designated role in NIH-wide coordination, we were well poised to lead some of the firearm initiatives across NIH. And in fact, we led and helped to coordinate the publication of funding opportunity announcements and distribution of funds in response to congressional appropriations in this research area. Next slide, please. So I'll walk you through some of these funding opportunity announcements that I just discussed. So one set of these funding announcements occurred in 2013 when NIH published 3 program announcements that were titled Research on the Health Determinants and Consequences of Violence and Its Prevention, particularly firearm violence. So the 3 funding mechanisms were an R01, which is usually a larger award to support projects over several years, an R03, which supports smaller research projects that can be carried out in a shorter period of time with limited resources, and an R21, which is intended to encourage exploratory and developmental research by providing support for the early and conceptual stages of project development. Through these program announcements, NIH funded 24 projects, with 12 of these being specific to firearm violence. And to date, 125 publications have resulted from these funding projects. I listed some examples of research that were funded under these announcements on the screen that you can review. Next slide, please. Outside of these designated program announcements, however, the NIH continued to accept applications for firearms research through different mechanisms, such as parent program announcements and funding opportunity announcements specific to an institute or center. So 17 firearms awards were funded from FY13 to fiscal year 2019 through these mechanisms. Another 12 were funded just last year through these mechanisms. So I've listed some examples on the slide of some of the names of IC specific funding opportunity announcements that funded firearms research throughout these past several years. And funding opportunity announcements such as these continue to be posted on a regular basis, so keep an eye out for more opportunities just like this. Next slide, please. While the NIH has always funded firearms research, we received an additional bolster of available funds in fiscal year 2020, so about 2 years ago, when appropriation report language allocated $12.5 million to the NIH to conduct research on firearm injury and mortality prevention. Specifically, Congress recommended that the NIH takes a comprehensive approach to studying underlying cause and evidence-based methods of prevention of injury, including crime prevention. The language is very precise in the types of applications that were eligible for funding. So grantees were required to fulfill certain requirements around open data, open code, pre-registration of research projects, and open access to research articles. And research had to be ideologically and politically unbiased, and no funds could be used to advocate or promote gun control. And then again, at the start of fiscal year 2021, so about a year ago, Congress again included nearly identical language in the fiscal year 2021 Consolidated Appropriations Act, which again provided the NIH with another $12.5 million to conduct research on firearm injury, mortality prevention with similar recommendations on a broad and comprehensive approach to firearm injury. Next slide, please. So both in fiscal year 2020 and fiscal year 2021, OBSSR helped to coordinate input from multiple institutes and centers at the NIH, and as a result developed 2 funding opportunity announcements per year for a total of 4 funding opportunity announcements. This resulted in a total of 19 additional awards. In this slide, I only show 2 funding announcements that funded awards relevant to youth firearm violence, but if you want to read more about the other funding announcements and awards, you can refer to the OBSSR website. So in particular, the PAR 20143 funding announcement funded 7 R61 awards for 2 years that were intended to be pilot, exploratory, or developmental projects. One relevant award included evaluating implementation and feasibility of evidence-based universal screening and intervention strategies for firearm injury and mortality prevention among youth and adults in emergency departments. Another relevant award from this funding announcement was Family Safety Net, developing an upstream suicide prevention approach to encourage safe firearm storage in rural and remote Alaskan homes. And then the PAR 21192 funding announcement funded 8 R01 awards for 3 years. And there's 3 relevant awards that I wanted to point out from this. One was a nationwide case control study of firearm violence prevention tactics and policies in K through 12 schools. A second was risk prediction and optimizing outcomes to 1 year after firearm injury among children using emergency services in the US. And another one I wanted to point out was preventing firearm violence in youth, a hospital-based prevention strategy. Next slide, please. So the NIH also continues to collaborate with other agencies to ensure that our priorities are aligned, that complementary research is being funded. So for example, we consulted with the CDC during the development of the fiscal year 20 funding opportunity announcements that both agencies published. And we also met with the CDC after receiving all the applications to make sure there weren't any overlapping applications. In addition, NIH has consulted with NIJ to give an update on the NIH CDC appropriations and also consulted with NIJ to ensure that there were no overlapping applications. And then most recently, CDC, NIH, and NIJ met to review topics to be supported across agencies, the complementary nature of grants, and the mission and process for each agency, in addition to potential future collaborations between agencies. We also reviewed an informal analysis of funded awards across different agencies to identify any trends and gaps. For example, we found that across all agencies, youth, urban populations, and populations that are underserved are the largest targeted populations of focus across all agencies. So I hope this shows that NIH, CDC, and other agencies such as NIJ do communicate throughout this process. Next slide, please. So I'll just end here with a reminder to please keep an eye out for new funding opportunity announcements. And remember that NIH always accepts investigator-initiated research on this topic. If you want to learn more about OBSSR specific efforts around violence research, please visit our website. We include resources there, such as report outs from a recent multi-phase workshop that was hosted by the Sexual and Gender Minority Research Office on violence and outcomes in the sexual and gender minority communities, and also links to other outreach activities such as webinars and violence prevention. You can contact myself or my colleague, Dr. Dara Blackman-Demner, with questions or requests for any other information. And I will stop there, pass it along to my colleague.
Greetings, thank you. Thank you all. I hope you all can hear me. It's a delight to be here. I'm going to talk about NICHD research priorities in firearms and violence research. I'm Valerie Mahomes, the Chief of the Pediatric Trauma and Critical Illness Branch at the NICHD. Next slide, please. As my colleague mentioned, the NIH consists of 27 institutes and centers, and I'm going to focus my attention on NICHD, which I have highlighted here. Next slide. I wanted to start out with a little bit of history just to put NICHD in context. NICHD was established under the administration of President John F. Kennedy in 1962, and we're about to celebrate our 60th anniversary. But one of the things that's most important about the establishment of the NICHD and the prior chart that I showed you with the various institutes and centers, that the president said that for the first time, we will have an institute to promote studies directed at the entire life process rather than towards specific diseases or illnesses. And what's important about this is that we are one of the few institutes that's not organ specific or disease specific, and that our work cuts across the lifespan. So I thought that was important to have you understand why we have the priorities that we do. Next slide. So in the establishment of NICHD, you can see here in this picture, the president's sister, Eunice Kennedy Shriver, handing him the pen to sign into legislation the establishment of NICHD. And of course, we have been doing the work that they envisioned since that time. Next slide. And in recognition of her work toward helping to establish the NICHD was renamed in 2007 by an act of Congress, named for Eunice Kennedy Shriver in recognition of her vision and dedication for her contributions to the founding of the Institute. And I might add that the late Senator Edward Kennedy was the one who introduced this legislation to have the name changed. And I bring this again to your attention so that as you recognize the priorities, as we walk through the priorities of the NICHD, you'll recognize and be able to connect the dots between the original conception of NICHD at its establishment, the critical work and the particular interests and vision of Eunice Kennedy Shriver, and why you'll see some of the kinds of priorities that I will walk you through momentarily. Next slide. So we'll take a closer look at these priorities. Next slide. So the NICHD just recently completed a strategic planning session. And because we are an institute that's not disease specific, we have a very, very broad mission. And so our former mission statement talked about NICHD promoting health and well-being, for all across the lifespan. And it just had such a broad and important reach that we wanted to be clearer in what our mission is, and to refine our vision statement so that it can be clearer in terms of what we are focused on and what our priorities are. So our new mission statement reads as follows, as you can see here on the screen. And I just want to underscore this last point about enhancing the lives of children and adolescents and optimize abilities for all. And you will be able to see that in all of our branches, the scientific priorities of our branches, this whole notion of optimizing abilities for all, enhancing the lives of children and adolescents. And following from that, our vision now is straightforward and clear and much more succinct: healthy pregnancies, healthy children, healthy and optimal lives. It still covers a broad scope of research and training, but you can see clearly what our areas of focus are. Next slide. So in that strategic plan, we identified 5 themes. We brought together researchers from around the country who have been both funded by NICHD and folks who were not funded by NICHD. We brought together members of the community to talk about where we see the NICHD going over the next 5 to 10 years. And 5 themes emerged from that strategic planning. For the purposes of today's talk, I just want to highlight the theme 4, improving child and adolescent health and the transition to adulthood. Next slide. So for theme 4, what we wanted to underscore is that we will invest in and support research and lead efforts to improve the transition of adolescents to adult healthcare providers, especially for those with chronic conditions or illnesses, disabilities, or childhood exposures that require special consideration, such as exposure to trauma or violence. And in this particular theme, you can see where the work that you do, where work on firearms and gun violence might fit in this particular scientific opportunity and scientific theme. Next slide. Here are other opportunities through this theme: to assess and explore prevention and treatment strategies to address the leading causes of trauma and injury in children and adolescents, including violence, maltreatment, accidental injury, self-injurious behavior, and motor vehicle crashes and accidents. Also, we want to underscore that we would support and see as an opportunity the need to develop critical care and rehabilitation pathways to optimize recovery for children who experience critical illness and traumatic injury. Next slide. For all of the strategic themes that we have developed, these are cross-cutting topics that we want to see in all the research that we support: health disparities, disease prevention, infectious disease, nutrition, and global health. Now, that doesn't mean that as you support and submit your applications, that all of these cross-cutting topics have to be evident in your application, but just for your awareness that we are interested in these topics, and whatever you submit through the investigator-initiated channel or through a special call for applications, we would be happy to entertain applications that look at health disparities and violence or disease prevention and violence and so on and so forth. Next slide. Our aspirational goal, I know this is a difficult button for you to see, but one of the things that we really wanted to underscore is our emphasis on training the next generation of researchers. And so you can see here that one of our aspirational goals is to train the next generation of scientists to do this work that we've outlined. Next slide, please. So NICHD is organized into scientific branches. We have 12 branches as well as our National Center for Medical Rehabilitation Research. For those of you that are doing this work with children and adolescents, I wanted to highlight the branches where you might find a home for your research. So our Child Development and Behavior branch is one of those scientific branches that falls under the auspices of our Division of Extramural Research, where there is an emphasis on family violence and bullying, as well as interpersonal processes and relationships. And that might be an area where you might find a home for your research. Next slide. Our population dynamics branch, I have a check here near that branch. We look at the broader implications of a particular public health concern or condition for the broader population. So we fund research in that area using large data sets, using census data, linking up data so that we can have a bigger sense of how a particular population might be impacted by a particular phenomenon, in this case, firearms and violence. I will spend the rest of my time talking about the branch that I represent, the Pediatric Trauma and Critical Illness branch. Next slide. Our branch is one of the newer entities within the NICHD, and you can see here the vision of our branch to essentially reduce all forms and aspects of childhood trauma, injury, and critical illness. Next slide. And so here are some of the highlights of our pediatric trauma and research and training program. Our branch has two broad programs, the pediatric trauma program and the pediatric critical illness program. And in the trauma program, you can see in the third bullet that we emphasize research into violence, violence-related injuries, as well as prevention, treatment, and medical outcomes of violence. And so you can see where there might be a home for your research here in our branch. Next slide. One of the things that I wanted to point out is that our branch is organized. We make our funding decisions and our priorities around what we call our continuum of care. And you'll note that this is a non-linear process where we look at prevention, intervention, treatment and care, recovery and psychosocial supports, and back to prevention, because children's lives don't just stop and start when they enter the hospital or a care facility, but we wanted to focus on the communities and the context that give rise to illness and injury and how we can continue to support them throughout this continuum. Next slide. One of the things that I thought you might be interested in is our funding trends in firearms research. You can see over the years how our funding has fluctuated, but with an uptick starting in 2015 and through 2018. And these are likely due to the funding opportunity announcements that my colleague mentioned earlier. And you can certainly see an uptick in the 2020 funding for firearms research, in part due to the funding opportunity announcements that was earlier discussed. And when the data come in for 2021, you'll likely see an even larger bar. Next slide. In terms of funding mechanisms, Caitlin did a great job of outlining some of the and highlighting some of the studies that were funded and those mechanisms. And you can see for NICHD, still for the most part, the R01 is our kind of workhorse and work engine for our research. And the vast majority of what we fund in this area of science uses the R601 mechanism. However, you might also note the R61, which is a mechanism that was used for this prior funding opportunity announcement. We don't accept the R61 as an investigator-initiated mechanism. However, we do support it when it is a part of a call for applications. I also wanted to highlight that you'll see some funding using the R13 mechanism, which is a scientific meeting mechanism. The F32, which is a postdoctoral fellowship, just again underscoring our interest in training and developing the next generation of researchers, as well as the R24 mechanism, which is a research resource funding mechanism. And this particular conference is supported by the R24 mechanism. Next slide. So the studies that we have funded fall together in a cluster around these research categories: mental health, health relevance, high risk exposure, firearm injury, risk and protective factors. For the purpose of this talk, I just want to highlight firearm injury. Next slide. So you can see for those projects that we have supported, I did this through the NIH reporter. You can do this search on your own. You can see that what was yielded through a general search for the NIH reporter looking at firearm research under the auspice, under the cluster of firearm injury, you can see the projects that we have funded, including the current R24 that we mentioned earlier that's funding this conference, small business innovation research, and so forth. And so it really gives you a good sense of what we have invested in and where there might be gaps. So as you're thinking about submitting your application, you can have a sense of where your science may be advancing what we're already doing. Next slide. So I just wanted to highlight a couple of the mechanisms that you don't typically hear about so that you can see what we have funded and what we're interested in. You'll note that this project, which is an R13 that I have circled above, is a conference grant scientific meeting project. And you'll note that one of the aims for this project is to establish through open community dialogue a research agenda for violence prevention that is salient and relevant to the community stakeholders. So we thought that this was an important area in terms of looking at ways in which to address disparities in violence prevention, including firearms. Next slide. This one, again, is an F32, a postdoctoral fellowship, where the applicant was looking for research and training post her doctoral studies to continue doing work in this area. And you can see that one of the aims here, aside from the training aims, was that the applicant wanted to develop a deeper understanding of the association between adult connection and odds of assault injury, and understand how those associations may differ as adolescent-adult relationships change across development. So again, for NICHD, development in that life course perspective is really important for us. And so integrating in those other priorities was an important area for us to invest in for this postdoctoral fellowship. Next slide. And the last study that I wanted to highlight, which Caitlin already mentioned, this was an R61 previously funded under the last call, and they sought to address the nation's high rate of firearm injuries by implementing healthcare-driven protocols to screen, intervene, and provide resources to those at risk of firearm injury. So you can see the breadth and scope of the types of projects that we funded for these initiatives, and some of which are also coming in through the investigator-initiated channel. Next slide. And again, it was already mentioned, I'll underscore that again, that you want to continue looking at our website and the OER website, the Office of Extramural Research website, for funding opportunity announcements. Here on the NICHD website, you can see where you can search for them. But I also want to point out that the vast majority of what we fund is investigator initiated. And so you are welcome to use the parent announcements for unsolicited studies, unsolicited applications to propose areas of research that meet and that align with the priorities that I've outlined, as well as the cross-cutting themes that the NICHD wants to shepherd through the next 5 to 10 years. Next slide. And so with that, I'll thank you for your time and attention and look forward to answering questions. Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to speak at this very important conference. I've enjoyed all the programming so far. So I'm Stephen O'Connor, and as mentioned earlier, I chief the Suicide Prevention Research Program at the National Institute of Mental Health. Next slide. A few points that I'm going to touch upon today begin by briefly providing an example of an injury prevention framework that reflects a lot of ways the priorities of the Division of Services and Intervention Research, NIMH. Talk about the NIMH emphasis on experimental therapeutics. Speak to NIMH suicide prevention grants, including elements of firearms and mortality prevention research, and then conclude by providing examples of NIMH funding opportunity announcements that could support firearm injury and mortality prevention research. Next slide. Okay, so this is probably a concept that many people being affiliated with injury prevention research centers are privy to. But William Haddon was really one of the main proponents of developing a field of injury prevention research. And a lot of his work was reflected in creating safer environments for driving on highways. So he helped really spearhead this by developing a framework known as the Haddon Matrix that looked at three different phases: the pre-event, the event, and the post-event in terms of the injury, and then also examining factors related to the host, person being injured, the agent or the vehicle being the source of the injury, the physical environment in which the injury occurs, and then the social environment as well. All of these happening at pre-event, event, post-event stages. And Carol Runyon updated the Haddon Matrix in a publication, Injury Prevention, in 1998, where not only identifying these really important factors from Haddon's Matrix, but also thinking about different decision criteria that organizations might use when they choose any particular intervention to try and introduce into an active healthcare system. So for instance, looking at the effectiveness of the intervention, what's the magnitude of the impact that would be brought about by introducing any specific intervention? What's the cost? What degree of freedom is impacted by introducing an intervention approach? Can you provide the intervention with equity to all those who need it? Is there any level of stigmatization that comes along with potentially receiving or providing the intervention? What are the preferences of a wide range of stakeholders? Most importantly, the service users. Is it feasible to deliver the intervention in the specific setting, in the context in which it's intended, as well as other identified criteria? So the decision criteria here, they really reflect a lot of the priorities of the Division of Services and Intervention Research. There are three different divisions that kind of bridge across the translational pipeline at NIMH. One is more basic sciences. In the middle is translational research. And then on the far end, that's really focused on having a near-term impact, is the Division of Services and Intervention Research. And there's a real focus on developing testing strategies that are highly scalable with a deployment focused, really trying to understand the implementation factors that also would impact whether or not this is a sustainable approach. Okay, next slide. When you're considering how to conduct an intervention that is focused on reducing risk of injury and mortality related to firearms, oftentimes people think about brief interventions. That's currently, where the field is, and they're often sort of derivatives of larger packages of evidence-based treatments. And now what we're trying to do is figure out which of these approaches can really be fit into unique contexts where we can make a meaningful difference and help people. So when you apply for an NIMH grant, there's a heavy emphasis on the idea of experimental therapeutics. And I'll explain what that means. It really is focusing on identifying first a conceptual framework that informs the intervention approach and the proximal target that you're trying to address, as well as the distal clinical outcome. So I am in the preventive and therapeutic intervention research branch, where a lot of our clinical trials that we fund are focused on delivering an intervention to individuals, families, or groups that are meant to address factors associated with risk, etiology, maintenance, and course, all of which, by changing those, you can impact distal clinical outcomes, symptom, problem severity, disorders, functioning. At NIH, in terms of firearm injury and mortality prevention, we do have a heavy focus on self-inflicted injuries, suicides, suicide attempts, as well as non-suicidal self-injury. So you would want to think about the empirically validated targets that have been shown to impact the distal clinical outcomes, and really having a strong evidence base to inform what your intervention approach is going to be. In the services branch, which is the other branch in the Division of Services and Intervention Research, a lot of those interventions that are being tested are looking at different implementation strategies that will engage service users, providers, administrators, payers, policymakers, or organizations and systems. And the targets or the factors that are really meant to be engaged by those intervention approaches are factors that facilitate or impede use, delivery, and outcomes, which then by turning those targets, you can see changes in access, engagement, and continuity, quality of care, equity, efficiency, and clinical status or functioning. Even in our pilot effectiveness studies, although they are most likely underpowered to detect significant differences in the distal clinical outcomes, within all of the funding opportunity announcements, there's a heavy emphasis on having an analytic plan that is going to examine the degree to which the intervention is engaging the targets, potentially changing those, and the degree to which that change accounts for the difference in the clinical outcome, as well as independently examining the association between the target and the distal outcome by itself. This is really important because if you are conducting a clinical trial and you find null effects, for example, but you don't have a really strong understanding of why it is that might have occurred, then we don't learn a lot from the investment that we've made. So by including a heavy emphasis on target engagement through this experimental therapeutics approach, we can better understand, for instance, is it that the target was not engaged at all? Or is it the target was engaged, but actually changing that target didn't lead to the expected distal clinical outcomes? Next slide. So at NIH, we have really two categories of active grants related to firearm injury and mortality prevention. One represent more comprehensive suicide prevention approaches that might entail interventions around firearms and suicide risk, and then other studies that specifically focus on addressing firearm injury and mortality prevention research. Safety planning, which I'm sure many people on here are familiar with, is featured prominently in the current portfolio for suicide prevention in our division, and because it often includes a section on making the environment safe, and that could include a discussion of firearms if it was pertinent to patient's characteristics. Next slide. So here's an example of a comprehensive approach. This is examining what's known as the National Zero Suicide Model, which is a health systems approach to reducing suicide risk. Brian Amadani at the Henry Ford Health System is conducting a comprehensive process and outcome evaluation of the Zero Suicide Model, implementation in real-world clinical settings across 6 large, diverse mental health research network affiliated learning healthcare systems, providing healthcare for over 9 million individuals each year. So the first aim is effectively to develop EHR metrics to measure specific quality improvement targets. And then the second aim is to examine the fidelity of specific zero suicide care processes implemented in each system. And then the third aim is to investigate suicide attempt and mortality outcomes within and across the zero suicide system model. Next slide. Here's an example of the zero suicide model, or a graphic, I should say. Really, zero suicide is meant to help organize different opportunities to engage someone that might be at risk. So there are 4 really important clinical aspects of this: screening and assessment for identifying people at risk, collaboratively developing a safety plan to put in place. Safety plan really isn't intended to address the things that are making someone suicidal per se, but it is an evidence-based approach to helping keep people safe, helping reduce suicide attempts, with the idea of keeping people in outpatient care out of the hospital and safe so that they can work on the issues that are actually making them feel like dying. So that's the third step, is treating suicidality with suicide-specific treatment. And then the fourth part is really heavy emphasis on continuity of care and having follow-ups to ensure that people don't fall through the gaps. Next slide. Brian Amadani and his team received a supplement to develop tools to evaluate the impact of safety planning and lethal means assessment on suicide outcomes. And so they're using EHR data that's unstructured to assess the occurrence of safety planning and lethal means assessment by applying a natural language processing approach. And they're using this ultimately to try to identify the completeness, the quality, and the integration of care of lethal means counseling and safety planning within this larger grant that they have. Next slide. I'll provide to you 2 examples of studies specific to firearm injury and mortality prevention research. The first is from Renab Betis, who was a moderator earlier today. And this work actually builds off of the R21 that my colleague Caitlin described earlier. This is a hybrid type 3 effectiveness implementation study with a longitudinal cluster randomized design that's focused on a comparative effectiveness trial of strategies to implement firearm safety promotion as a universal suicide prevention strategy in pediatric primary care. This is also taking place within the Mental Health Research Network. It's going to involve 151 clinicians and 32 clinics who serve almost 40,000 youth annually. And there's 2 different versions of the GunSafe program that they will be evaluating. All 32 clinics receive GunSafe materials, including brief training and cable locks. Half are randomized to EHR implementation strategy, and then half receive the same strategy, but they also receive 1 year of facilitation to target additional clinician and organizational implementation barriers. Next slide. And also a study that was mentioned earlier, funded to Lisa Wexler through the R61 mechanism, is developing an upstream suicide prevention approach to encourage safe firearm storage in rural and remote Alaskan homes. This study is also happening in practice-based settings, real-world clinics, in this case, primary care in Alaska. And there's a really heavy emphasis on engaging the community so that there's a strong participatory approach in the beginning stages to adapt and refine a brief intervention with the intent of trying to increase safe storage of firearms by engaging parents, all of this with the intent of reducing suicide risk in youth. Next slide. And I'll close by bringing to your attention a few funding opportunity announcements that possibly could fund firearm injury and mortality prevention research. The first is practice-based suicide prevention research centers. These are very large endeavors. These are 5-year, $2 million per year in direct funds grants that will fund 1 R01 signature project, 3 R34 pilot studies, seed funding for 2 R03 research projects, as well as a heavy emphasis on training a new batch of researchers for suicide prevention research. The second funding opportunity announcement involves service-ready tools for identification, prevention and treatment of individuals at risk for suicide. So there's a really strong need in the field to increase the likelihood that clinics are able to offer evidence-based approaches for suicide prevention. And we need better tools and technologies to help scale those up. The third is a funding opportunity announcement focused on pilot effectiveness trials for post-acute interventions in services to optimize longer-term outcomes. And you can always look to our suite of clinical trials funding opportunity announcements to find a wide variety of funding opportunity announcement to match the stage of science for what you're proposing to conduct. Okay, and with that, I'll conclude and turn it over to my colleague. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Nathan Stinson. I'm the director of the Division of Community Health and Population Science at NIMHD. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about some of the work we're doing in violence research. Next slide, please. The mission of our institute is to lead scientific research to improve minority health and reduce health disparities. And to accomplish this, we plan, coordinate, evaluate NIH-wide minority health and health disparities research. We conduct and support research specifically on minority health disparity. We promote the training of a diverse research workforce. Translate and disseminate research information, and foster innovative collaboration and partnerships, both within the federal sector and with community-based organizations. Next slide, please. The populations of focus for NIMHD are what's called NIH designated populations with health disparities. Those are the racial and ethnic minorities as defined by the census, sexual and gender minorities, social economically disadvantaged populations, and underserved rural populations. NIH has a process that it goes through in designating particular groups as far as a health disparities population based on looking at available information on health outcomes in certain groups in comparison with the population in general. These are the current ones. In the future, we may designate other populations as well. Next slide. When NIMHD went through its visioning process a couple of years ago, one of the things that we really wanted to do is not just develop a vision for the Institute itself, but to try to develop a vision for the extramural community, as well. Health disparities is a complex problem, and it really deserves a complex solutions, if we are going to improve the health of all the racial and ethnic minority groups and close the gaps between different populations. And so we developed what we labeled as our minority health and health disparities research framework. And we add this framework to all of our funding opportunity announcements and ask applicants to really talk about where within this framework their project really would sit. And essentially, it's really, an effort to get the extramural community to think about addressing things on multiple levels of influence and also, multiple domains of influence. Instead of just focusing on one of these particular, boxes, in this chart, really look at ways that you can design a research project that really would have interventions on multiple of these boxes as a way of really trying to maximize the impact of the research protocol. Next slide. Here, the priorities for our institute around violence research are codified in Notice MD 18006. It is relatively broad. It includes intimate partner violence, family violence, child and elder abuse, suicide, gang violence, hate crimes, bullying, school violence, and community violence. It includes, but it's not limited to just firearm violence. Next slide. We have promoted the use of the different types of research projects, from observational studies to interventions, but we also support, policy research and health services research, although not really focused on animal studies. Really human subjects type research in this area is where we really make our major investment. And as I just mentioned, really looking towards multi-level, multi-domain studies to really understand either the consequences and causes of violence or interventions to prevent violence, victimization, or perpetration, and address the disparities in violent or trauma-related healthcare and other services. Violence can be considered as a health outcome or as a determinant of other health outcomes. And violence research can be submitted to any of the NIMHD issued funding opportunity announcements. Next slide. Just a couple of slides with some specific examples. A few years ago, we put out a funding opportunity announcement on youth violence prevention interventions that incorporate racism or discrimination prevention. We funded 5 RO1s from this particular funding opportunity announcement. Next slide. Here's also a listing of some other projects that we have funded that related to violence research that represent several different mechanisms. R21, there's also a KO1 within this grouping, and a half dozen RO1s as well. And as you can see, if you can read this very, very small print, it's really a wide range of topics within the violence sphere that we are supporting. Next slide. But before I go to this slide, but you can leave that one there, I just want to mention 2 other projects that I unfortunately didn't have the time to insert this slide into the deck here. They were the result of a funding opportunity announcement that Caitlin mentioned in the beginning, PAR 21, 192, Firearm Injury and Mortality Prevention Research. We're supporting 2 projects under this funding opportunity. The first one is Predicting and Preventing Gun Violence, an evaluation of Ready Chicago. And this program is a randomized controlled trial for men at the highest risk of gun violence, designated to test behavioral informed and social service-based approach. The Ready initiative identifies men in the Chicago area at highest risk of being involved in shooting through 3 methods. One is machine learning predictions based on administrative arrest and victimization records, referral from street outreach staff working in the community around Chicago, and screening among individuals who were leaving prison or jail. And the Ready initiative provides 18 months of supported, subsidized work alongside cognitive behavioral therapy and personal development program. And the last project I want to mention is titled The Individual, Situational, and Contextual Risk Factors for Violent Firearms. And this project will compile a large database on violent crime to examine a number of measures intended to capture the diverse nature of firearm violence, including gun violence not resulting in physical injury, gun violence resulting in non-fatal injury, and gun violence resulting in death. And this project will examine variations in these different types of gun violence, according to a wide range of individual, situational, and contextual factors using models to really examine both the likelihood of each form of gun violence, but also the rates of of gun violence. So that's just a very, very quick snapshots of some of the work that our institute is doing around violence and specifically firearms research. Please visit our website where we give a much more complete list of all the different projects that we are funding. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions, and I'll pass it on to my colleague.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Mark mentioned, my name is Tom Simon, and I'm the Associate Director for Science in CDC's Division of Violence Prevention. I'm so thankful to be here to talk about the research and surveillance work that we're funding at CDC. Last year, after nearly 25 years, CDC received a new appropriation specifically to address firearm injury. This funding is so important for supporting research and surveillance to help guide firearm injury prevention. Next slide, please. So firearm-related violence is clearly a significant public health problem that affects thousands of people, their families, schools, and communities every year. Preventing firearm-related violence and injuries and deaths is a priority for CDC. CDC's national vital statistics data indicate that there are over 109 firearm-related injury deaths a day, 764 deaths a week, and 3,300 deaths in a month on average. Next slide, please. So I'm going to provide some basic epidemiologic data as context for CDC's current funding activities. And I wanted to mention that all the statistics that I'm presenting are available online through CDC's web-based Injury Statistics Query and Reporting System, or Whiskers. I really encourage you to check it out if you haven't yet. Earlier today, Dr. Cook actually described it as fun to use, which I consider to be high praise, and I'm going to pass that on to my colleagues who oversee Whiskers. But it really is a helpful resource because you can access mortality data and morbidity data by intent, mechanism, year, age group, race, ethnicity, by state. You can look at leading causes of death. So it can be a very helpful resource for grant applications to be able to compare the local burden relative to what's happening in your state or what's happening nationally. Next slide, please. So when we look at the national data, we see that patterns of firearm-related injuries vary substantially depending on whether you're talking about deaths or non-fatal injuries. This slide shows that there's nearly 40,000 firearm deaths a year, and most firearm deaths are suicide, followed by homicide. Next slide, please. So deaths receive a lot of attention, but it's important to keep in mind that there's about 3 times as many non-fatal injuries as deaths, and the pattern is very different. The vast majority, 76%, are assault-related, and 19% are unintentional. There are very few non-fatal self-harm firearm injuries, and this is due largely to the high case fatality rate when firearms are used in suicide attempts. Next slide, please. There's also compelling patterns by age groups. This slide shows firearm homicide rates in dark blue and firearm suicide rates in light blue by age group. So firearm homicide rates are highest among younger people, ages 15 to 34, and tend to decrease with age, while firearm suicide rates tend to increase with age and are highest among older Americans. Next slide, please. There's also important patterns by race and ethnicity. Firearm homicide rates are highest among the non-Hispanic Black population. Firearm suicide rates are highest among the non-Hispanic white population. The American Indian or Alaska Native population has relatively high firearm homicide and suicide rates. We also know that firearm homicide rates are generally higher in urban than rural areas, with rates of firearm suicide, or the opposite is true for firearm suicide because they're often higher in rural communities. So I mention this because it's really important for research to consider the contextual factors that contribute to variations in risk across communities and populations, including social determinants of health, such as economic and educational opportunities, access to services, policies and programs related to health, neighborhood crime and connectedness, and social factors related to race, SES, and self-protection. Next slide, please. So now I want to turn to the new funding. As I mentioned, in FY20, CDC received a new appropriation to address firearm injury. The appropriations report language was the same as what Caitlin shared for NIH. Basically, Congress asked us to take a comprehensive approach to studying the underlying causes and evidence-based approaches to prevent firearm injuries, deaths, and crime. We used some of the funds to enhance firearm injury surveillance efforts, but the bulk of it to fund new research. Next slide, please. So I'll briefly mention surveillance first. A key challenge facing existing surveillance systems is the 2 to 3 year lag before national data are available, as well as gaps in the data that are available at the state and local levels. So one of the data initiatives is focused on syndromic surveillance. It's appropriately called FASTER, which stands for Firearm Surveillance Through Emergency Rooms. Next slide, please. So FASTER has 2 objectives. The first is to increase the timeliness of aggregate reporting of emergency department visits for non-fatal injuries. And the second is to disseminate these findings to key stakeholders working to prevent or respond to firearm injuries. These data have the potential to provide timely and actionable information on non-fatal firearm injuries that communities can use for prevention. Next slide, please. We're funding 10 health departments to do this work. Being able to detect trends, the clustering of emergency department visits, and changing patterns for non-fatal firearm injuries in near real time at the local and state level is a significant advance that we're very excited about. Next slide, please. In addition to non-fatal data, surveillance of homicides and suicides remains critical. CDC's National Violent Death Reporting System provides unique circumstance information that's just not available elsewhere. And we do this by combining data from coroners, medical examiners, and law enforcement reports. We're using some of the funding to improve the completeness, the timeliness, and the quality of the firearm variables within NVDRs. Next slide, please. These appropriations also allowed us to release new research funding opportunities that just would not have been possible otherwise. So we issued 2 new research announcements in FY 2020. One was for investigator-initiated research to understand and prevent firearm-related injuries, deaths, and crime. And it called for etiologic research to improve understanding and inform the development of new prevention strategies, as well as rigorous evaluation research on promising and innovative prevention strategies. The funding announcement gave examples of possible focus areas under each, but the objectives were generally quite broad, which allowed flexibility for the PIs to pursue unique opportunities. And the announcement offered 2 funding options: 2-year projects that were funded up to $350,000 a year, and 3-year projects that were funded up to $650,000. Next slide, please. We were fortunate to support 16 new research studies. 7 are 2-year projects and 9 are 3-year projects. They really provide a good mix across the research objectives and topics, geography, and populations. Next slide, please. We're funding research focused on understanding risk and protective factors across a range of topics. Some examples include the factors influencing gun-related attitudes, behaviors, access, carrying, and safety practices, factors related to different forms of firearm-related injury, and research on direct and indirect neighborhood-level exposures and related demographic, temporal, social, and economic factors. Etiologic studies are using a range of data sources, including innovative uses of existing data and creative linkages across data sources. They're all being done with the goal of informing prevention activities. Next slide, please. Now, other studies are rigorously evaluating a range of prevention approaches, including hospital-based interventions to prevent future victimization and perpetration, bystander approaches, crisis intervention approaches to enhance safety during times of acute crises, as well as firearm safety interventions to reduce unintentional injuries among children. Studies are looking at a range of behavioral and injury outcomes, including those related to unintentional suicide, as well as assault-related intents. And all of them are designed to help build the evidence base for effective strategies. Next slide, please. The focus of the studies varies quite a bit. Some are national in scope, others are focused on states and local areas. Within states, some of the projects are focused in urban areas, but a few are specifically focused on rural areas. And the studies range from a focus on the general population to studies focused specifically on children, youth, or adults, as well as active duty or veteran populations. And some focus on universal populations, regardless of risk, while others focus on groups experiencing elevated risk. Next slide, please. So we're also supporting 2 new investigator awards to help build the next generation of firearm violence prevention researchers. This funding supports a mentored research experience. And one PI is focused specifically on developing a social media-based intervention that can enhance street outreach programs to reduce cyber banging, which has been implicated in youth firearm violence. And the second PI is describing variations in programs and policies across neighborhoods in Cleveland, Ohio, and Detroit, Michigan, to identify the neighborhood level exposures that are most predictive of youth firearm violence and suicide. Next slide, please. So in the limited time that I had today, I just focused on the projects funded from the FY 2020 appropriation. And I'm not able to mention all the studies funded because there just wasn't be enough time, funded 16 of them, but they're all fully described on our new firearm violence prevention webpage. And I wanted to mention this because in addition to being able to read about the studies and the surveillance projects, the page also has a section on fast facts, including some key definitions and statistics and consequences, as well as a range of resources that you might find helpful. Next slide. So I also wanted to briefly mention that CDC has released a 5-year strategic vision for violence prevention. It's guided by the 4 principles shown here. These include advancing equity, addressing factors that are relevant across multiple forms of violence, enhancing positive relationships and environments, and prioritizing efforts that create social and community level impact. Next slide, please. And over the next 5 years, the division is going to focus in specifically on 3 key strategic priorities. In addition to focusing on expanding our understanding of how to prevent firearm-related injuries and deaths, our division is also focused on increasing the number of people exposed to prevention strategies proven to reduce risk. We're doing this because just decades of research have identified effective violence prevention strategies, yet widespread implementation has just not been achieved. And we're also focused on reducing adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. This is because exposure to violence and other ACEs in childhood can impair physical, emotional, and social development and have lifelong consequences. So these priorities and principles are reflected across our research and programmatic initiatives. Next slide, please. I just want to end by sharing that we've already forecasted 2 new funding opportunities for the fiscal year 22 that include a focus on firearm injury prevention. The first is an R01 grant announcement, and the intent here is to support research to help inform the development and evaluation of innovative and promising opportunities to enhance safety and prevent firearm-related injuries, deaths, and crime. And the second is a Mentored Research Scientist Development Award, or KO1, and the intent is to provide support for an intensive mentored career development research experience. And under the KO1 forecast, it includes encouragement of research focused specifically on firearm-related behavior, crime, injuries, and deaths among children and youth. Next slide, please. So the full funding announcements are not posted yet, but if you're interested in learning more, I strongly encourage you to subscribe to grants.gov forecasts so that you can receive updates on the announcement and any subsequent amendments. Next slide, please. I just want to end by thanking you for making time to participate in the session today. I also want to thank my CDC colleagues who contributed to the presentation and are really helping to guide the firearm prevention work at CDC, particularly Drs. Linda Dahlberg, James Mercy, and Marcy Wright. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to share this because this is the link to the firearm injury prevention webpage I mentioned. Thank you so much. Back to you, Mark.
Thank you, Tom. And thank you all for really interesting and promising presentations. If you can all put your cameras back on so we can do a couple of minutes of Q&A. I realize it's late in the day. We won't go very long with Q&A, but I at least have one question I'd like to ask. And if others do, please put them in the Q&A spot on the bottom of your screen. This is really more for the NIH colleagues, Tom, because I'm going to ask about a P50s. You know, as you know, P50s are these center grants. They're usually specific calls around them. And just wanted to ask, if there's anything we can do to see if we can get some P50s working around trauma and firearm injury. And B, are there already some ideas on the books for moving something in those directions? It's a tough question. I know I'm putting you a little bit on the spot, so, but you know, talk to us about the idea of, and maybe if somebody can talk a little bit about what a P50 is, that might also help the folks who are listening.
Well, I certainly can say a few words about what the P50 is. This is Valerie Mahomes from NICHD. It's a specialized research center grant, and it's a multi-component funding mechanism. So meaning that like your R01, we expect a hypothesis testing line of inquiry, and researcher may have a team or multidisciplinary team of individuals following a protocol or whatever the case may be, but to pursue that line of inquiry. With the center grant, you would have an infrastructure to facilitate, depending on what was requested for that particular P50, you would have the infrastructure to facilitate the bringing together of multiple disciplines to pursue multiple lines of inquiry. So there's usually an administrative core. Some center grants have a data analytic core. Some of them have research project cores. They require at least 1 or 2 research projects, and some of them have outreach cores. And I'm speaking specifically now regarding a P50 funding mechanism that we use to support child maltreatment research called the Capstone Centers for Multidisciplinary Research in Child Maltreatment. And so we have that structure. Other program staff from within our institute and across other institutes might be using that more in different ways. So we do not have any plans for using the P50 you know, in terms of firearms research at this point. So I don't have any crystal ball in that regard. I can't comment on that question, but it is a very productive mechanism when it's available to be used.
You else want to comment about that? That covers it, the idea. So you can see why that question came up. Caitlin, I just also have a quick question for you, and that is, I know the CDC has played a role in the White House Community Violence Initiatives on the webinars they've been putting on. I know that because they've been asking me for names of people who could potentially present. Is the NIH playing a role in any of that work as well?
Yes, we've played a similar function where we've helped to recommend speakers and helped to make sure that they're advertising to the right folks. So that's basically been our role at this point. We also have it on our OVSSR website as a resource that people can access. But that's pretty much the part that we've played at this point.
Great. Well, we didn't get too many questions. So I think given that the late hour, and we're almost at the end of our time for the symposium in any event, first I wanted to thank all of you. I also wanted to thank NICHD especially. They funded FACS, and so thank you, Valerie, for your support, and NICHD, and the University of Michigan, who has also helped support the conference. This is our 3rd conference. The first one was in person, the last 2 obviously virtual. Hopefully next year we'll have it in person again. And I'm really delighted to see the movement that's happening already in the last 5 years. When we submitted this R24, we were sort of taking a risk to say, we need this area to kind of start kicking off, to kick off a field and a pipeline. And where we've been over the last 5 years and where we are today is truly a testament to everybody here. I want to thank all the participants who are here today as well. While I'm thanking people, I want to also thank everybody who made this day possible. Carrie Mussoff, Lee Roque, and Carissa Pelletier, both are FACS postdocs. Taylor Huatala, Beth Costello, Lisa Orison, Kai Lee, Sonia Comet, Serena Smith, Amanda Ballesteros, Lynn Massey, and Leni Roop, both of whom did the heavy lift for today. So special thanks to you as well. And I mean, I'm just amazed. We have more work to do, but I was delighted to see how many new ideas and early career researchers are getting involved. Exciting angles on the ideas and the topics being covered, ideas about data and what kind of data we need and what avenues going forward for that, prevention approaches. And what I'm most delighted with is how all of the studies had really strong, thoughtful methods. And so the field is growing, and that's the most exciting part. So I want to say I hope to see you all back next year. We'll be sending out a quick survey later this week, and we value your input to make this an even more productive time next year. So please take a minute to complete that. I also want to let you know that we have recorded all the sessions. So if you missed something, or you want to go back, or you want to share some of today with people, you can go to the same website that you got to sign on today, which is childfirearmsafety.org, all one word. They should be up in about a week. And you can also follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @facts_safety. So finally, thank you all very much. Appreciate it. Nice to see some of you who I do know, and to have met some new people. So with that, have a really great week. Be safe, and thanks.